Check podcast. Please hold. Your ears are very important to us. Please hold on, and our program will begin shortly. The Soundcheck podcast is coming up. Please continue to hold. Keep up with the Soundcheck podcast and everything that's happening in the New Sounds empire. Just go to newsounds.org and follow us on social media. All of the icons are in the top right corner of the page. All of our other musicians are currently playing for other customers. Please stay with us, and someone will play for you in just a moment. From newsounds.org, welcome to a special edition of our Soundcheck podcast series, which normally brings us live performances from our New York Public Radio studio. But today, we are in the Green Space, which is New York Public Radio's ground floor performance venue, because it is equipped for multimedia, and we today are presenting a live performance of music with interactive audio and visuals from pianist Dan Tepfer. I'm John Schaefer. We are streaming live on Facebook and YouTube. Dan Tepfer is a sought-after jazz pianist. He caught a lot of people's attention about 8 years ago with an album of improvisations on the Bach-Goldberg variations. His new record is called Natural Machines, and for the moment, I'll describe it as a combination of live piano and interactive computer. Dan is here to fully explain what he's done and to do some of it. Here's Dan Tepfer with a live performance of a piece called Constant Motion. Well, that is Dan Tepfer and a live performance from New York Public Radio's Green Space, not at our piano, but at a Yamaha disclavier of a piece called Constant Motion, which you'll find on his most recent record called Natural Machines. Dan, it's great to have you here. There is a version of this on your record, but it's a very different piece from what we just heard, right?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, John. The idea with this project, with Natural Machines, is that it's this intersection of organic processes and mechanical processes, and that's why I called it Natural Machines. And when I play a quote-unquote piece, like what I just played, which I call Constant Motion, it's actually not a piece. Like what I'm really doing here is I'm improvising freely. I'm just trying to sit here and play the sounds that come into my ear at this moment, but the rules surrounding my improvisation remain the same. And in this case, it's these rules that take whatever I'm playing and in real time generate a reflection of it either up or down, and it kind of creates this alternating feeling to it that always takes me into a kind of a minimalistic zone.
Well, it's a very pattern-based kind of that algorithm for that piece. And so the visuals that were also being generated had a very kind of pattern basis to them as well. So let me ask you, though, so for anybody who was listening to that and thinking, how is one person playing all this music? The answer is you weren't playing all the music. The piano was, but you weren't. Explain how this instrument works.
Yeah, I would say in the piece I just played, I was playing about half the music.
Mm-hmm.
And the other half of the music was generated in real time by programs I've written on my computer and expressed in acoustic sound by the piano itself. So what this means is I'm playing and the information describing what I played is immediately sent to my computer. And on my computer, I'm running these programs that make certain decisions about how to respond, and they send back data to the piano for it to play. And so the keys are being activated right around what I'm playing as I play.
Right. So basically the disclavier is like a player piano. It doesn't actually need a pianist. You know, it could play itself.
Yeah, and I would say most of the time it does. You know, it's the kind of thing you see in airports and hotels playing pre-recorded performances. But for me, I just discovered, 5 or 6 years ago, I didn't even think about this before, that it can take real-time input, that you don't have to pre-record anything, that you can just send it a command and it'll play it as soon as possible, with a little bit of delay, but virtually none. And I got really excited about that because as somebody who's spent his life developing a sound on an acoustic piano, anytime I would interact with like electronic sounds or algorithmic processes, the computer would be responding with a digital sound, an
Right.
electronic sound. And to me, those worlds are, you can make them work together, but it's kind of a challenge. Whereas with the computer expressing itself fully on the piano with exactly the same sound that I'm using, I just feel a kind of a togetherness with the computer, with the algorithm that I don't think I could achieve any other way.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things about this project is, there's lots of electroacoustic music out there, and I don't know if you're familiar with David Behrman's music, but he was a pioneer of this going back to the 70s, live interactivity between a computer and acoustic instruments. But of course, you could always tell which was doing what. Here, as you say, you're playing the piano, and the computer is playing that exact same piano. Let me ask you, what happens if you want to hit a note and the computer wants to play that note at the same time?
A big part of what I like about this project is that it's all about constraints. And that's actually one of the constraints of this project is because this is a physical instrument, if the computer has already played a note and I try to play it, it's already down. I can't play it.
Right.
So that's one of the, kind of tightrope walk aspects of this project. I have to be navigating that, and I kind of like that.
Yeah. And the visuals, is that the result of an algorithm? Did you write those programs as well?
Yeah, this is something I like to explain about this project. I've written every line of code in this project, and so what you're seeing, what you're hearing the computer do, and what you're seeing the computer generate in the graphics is just as homemade as every other aspect of what I do in my artistic life. You know, be it me sitting at the piano or me composing for orchestra or string quartet. And you know, I've spent just as much time on each one of those lines of code. And so with the visuals, what I'm trying to do is reveal the underlying structure of each algorithm as much as possible. So for example, in the one we just saw in constant motion, the idea with that circular representation is to kind of indicate that the kind of constant motion, the churning element of it, that this repetitive
that you're cycling through, and
exactly, yeah.
So the cyclical nature of the music is very visually represented in that set of visuals. So each piece has its own different musical and visual algorithm.
Yeah, that's right.
And that is, in a sense, that's the score of the piece, right? Is the code.
Totally, yeah. The score of the piece is the rules that I have to face every time I improvise with that algorithm.
Which is why you can continually call what you do in that piece constant motion, even if every note is different from the last time you played it.
Exactly. This is what really fascinates me about constraints. And, you know, this is something artists have been dealing with for thousands of years. But if you look at somebody like Bach, you know, who's obviously a huge inspiration for me and many people, you see him decide to, for example, do a canon at the unison, you know? And often when he does that, the title is Canon at the Unison. And even though he's done, you know, a number of canons at the unisons in his life, and they're all different, they're all part of the same family. And the fact that it's a canon at the unison gives it a kind of an identity that, to me, and I would imagine to Bach, makes it almost like that's one piece, all of those, if you put them together, you know?
Or looked at another way, these are kind of etudes. You know, he was studying, which is what etude literally means, how to write a canon with voices in unison or voices a third apart or whatever it is. And with each of your pieces, you're studying how to play with a computer program that is going to take every note that you play and reflect it or produce an arpeggiation from it, or whatever, you know, whatever you've decided it's going to be.
That's exactly right. And the hope is that every time I sit down with it, if I'm sufficiently awake and present, I'm going to discover new ways of dealing with each one of those algorithms.
Yeah. So with the visuals, are you familiar with cymatics? Do you know what cymatics are?
The name is familiar, but
Yeah, so it's there are various ways to do it, but it's a way of representing sound visually. Like a very simple thing would be a metal plate with sand on it, or maybe a thin sheet of water, and when the sound hits it, you see rings and waves, and
I've definitely seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So do you get into any of that sort of thing with? I mean, it seems like a pretty natural way to represent sound in
yeah, so
visual.
when you're doing that, when you're, you know, say you take a vibrating membrane and you make it vibrate at a certain frequency and you put sand on it, what you're really doing is the sand is going to bunch at the places where the membrane is not moving.
Right.
So at what we call the nodes
the
of
nodes,
the membrane,
yes.
right? And so what you're really doing is representing the interaction of that frequency with that specific membrane, and specifically the size of the membrane. And so where the sand stays is really is telling you this is the way this frequency feels to this membrane.
Right.
And it's like a very visual way of seeing that. And those are, I mean, in many ways, that's exactly what I'm trying to achieve in the visuals here, is to give this kind of synesthetic experience of not adding anything to the music. Like if you think of, what is that called?
Cymatics.
Cymatics. If you think of something like cymatics, there's no additional information, right? It's really just the pure audio signal that's being represented. So what you see is directly connected. It's not like an extra narrative. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do in the narrative, in my visuals as well. It's just represent the music as purely as possible.
All right, now the piece you're going to play next is called Triad Sculpture.
Yeah.
All one word.
Yeah.
So what's the algorithm for this piece?
So this is actually one of the only, well, it's the only piece on the album, because the album has 11 different pieces. It's the only piece where the computer doesn't actually play the piano at all. This is actually kind of an outlier on the album because it's all about studying tuning ratios.
Okay.
So, I mean, this would take us forever to
Right.
get
And
into
when I
this.
heard this piece on the album, there's a kind of a lingering, lasting sound, which I assumed was the algorithm providing some sort of ambience. But what is it actually?
Yeah, so let me take a step back.
Yeah.
If you think about something like a perfect fifth.
Ooh.
Let me turn that algorithm
We
off.
just saw something happen there.
If you think of a perfect fifth, something like that, like a C and a G.
Right.
In the time that the C is vibrating twice, the G is vibrating 3 times.
Right.
And that's just a basic property of the harmonic series. It would take a long time to explain, but the point is, like, you can express an interval like that, like a perfect fifth, both as 2 pitches resonating together in harmony, or as rhythm.
So 3/2.
3/2, like. That's a perfect fifth. And in fact, I've written programs where I'll just take that and then speed it up gradually, and you'll start to hear a perfect fifth. Or a major third. That's 4/5. So that's a major third. But the thing is, pianos aren't tuned in exactly that way. Pianos, for very deep historical reasons that allow us to play in all different keys, are tuned in what we call equal temperament.
Right.
And so instead of it being, for example, for a major third, exactly 5/4, with those whole number ratios, it's going to be these numbers that come from the 12th root of 2.
Right, which is an irreducible, irrational,
it's an irrational number.
Fraction.
Yeah. And so what we lose when we play on a piano or any of these equal tempered instruments is the perfect resonance of, for example, a major third that has no dissonance to it. It's like a perfectly consonant interval. Whereas on the piano, you can actually hear it. You can hear how that it's very sharp.
If you were able to hold that for a very long time, you would begin to feel it as a dissonant sound.
Absolutely. I hear it right away. And so what I'm doing here in this program is that I'm representing these ratios, the ratios between the sounds of the chords I play in my left hand visually. And so I'm turning that ratio, for example, 5/4, or with a major triad, we're talking about 6/5/4, minor triad, 10/12/15. I'm representing those on the 3 axes of 3 dimensions, and it's creating these 3-dimensional figures that you'll see rotating, and that are actually a direct representation of each one of these harmonies. But also, because I want us to be able to hear exactly what those harmonies sound like when they're in just intonation, meaning with those whole
Natural
number ratios.
tuning, yeah.
I also have the computer generate just like a pure sine wave representation in sound of those harmonies with the actual intonation that we're seeing. So if you see a really simple figure on the screen rotating, that's in just intonation. Like it could be, for example, 6/5/4 for a major triad, and you're also going to hear that kind of organ-like sound tuned in exactly that same way, whereas the piano is still going to be an equal temperament.
Right. So we'll see a kind of a crunchy looking figure, and that's the piano, and anything that's like really perfectly geometric is the pure intervals.
That's right. Yeah. When it's crunchy and more complex, that means it's being tuned in equal temperament.
Right.
And every time we're hearing a sound from the computer, that is actually what's being represented. So sometimes I've decided to tune things in equal temperament, and we're also hearing equal temperament from the computer.
Okay.
But with these, I basically have done that for contrast, just like an artistic decision.
Right,
because
sure.
it's nice to go back from one to the other. But as you were saying, when we see these pure figures, we're also hearing the pure just intonation tuning from the computer.
All right. So Dan Tepfer is here with us on this edition of the Soundcheck podcast from newsounds.org. Coming to you from the green space. We're here because it is equipped to handle both sound and music. And so Dan and this Yamaha disc clavier will perform the piece called Triad Sculpture. Live performance of a piece called Triad Sculpture from Dan Tepfer, pianist and composer and coder and the creator of the algorithms that provide both the sound and the visuals that accompany these improvisations on the Yamaha Disclavier. And that piece, Triad Sculpture, is on Dan's most recent album called Natural Machines. Dan, one of the things we were talking about is, the Disclavier, providing sound, not in that piece necessarily, but in most of these Natural Machines works, and the visuals that are kind of representing what you're doing in real time. What we didn't mention is that you, as a live performer in the moment, are watching those visuals. You're hearing what the piano is providing to you back after you've played your improvisation. So it creates kind of a feedback loop, right? Because you're responding in turn to what the instrument and the visuals are giving you.
Yeah, I think the feedback loop is such a central part of this project because, it'd be one thing if I played, I've there are researchers who do this, for example. You play something and then you feed it into a neural network and then it'll maybe play you something back that's a response to it. What I'm doing is kind of different from that because in many ways it's actually simpler because the computer is responding with algorithms and not something more complex like a neural network. It's just rules, similar kinds of rules to what Bach used. But as a result, it's responding so quickly. For example, in that first improvisation I did with constant motion, I mean, we're talking about it. It's responding, a quarter of a second after I've played, and so as soon as I play something, it's responding to what I played. But I'm an improviser, so as soon as it plays something, I'm responding to it. I mean, that's
right.
what I do as an improviser, right? So it's a constant feedback loop, and it's such a feedback loop that it's almost not even back and forth. It's just constantly both together. And you make a really good point about this last one. In all of them, I love looking at the screen, but in this last one, Triad Sculpture, I just find those figures, the three-dimensional figures that come from expressing the ratios of those harmonies in 3 dimensions, I find them so moving.
Yeah.
Even after having performed this a fair amount of times now, I still find them really beautiful, and they just really touch me somehow. And even though the computer's not playing the piano in that piece, it's expressing that, and that is its own kind of feedback loop. Looking at it just inspires me to play a certain way.
And the computer's also providing that sine wave tone that we heard, sort of swooping and gliding, especially towards the second half of the piece.
Yeah.
So it's art, it's technology, but it also raises questions that are almost philosophical. I wanted to ask you, what happens if you play a wrong note? But then I realized if the algorithm is taking every note you play and following it with a certain set of rules, there's no such thing as a wrong note.
Yeah, from a certain point of view, that's true, because in free improvisation, there's no such thing as a wrong note. Art Tatum has that great quote. He says, there are no wrong notes. There are only wrong ways of leaving a wrong note.
Right.
And it's totally true. In the hands of a master like Tatum, he could play any note and find a way to make it work in the context. I've been an improviser my whole life, and this is really what I try to do is be able to do that same thing where I can just really follow my inspiration wherever. But I'll tell you one thing, the computer here is taking everything I do and transforming it and sending it back to me. So if I play something that I don't like, or something that is not grooving, something that's just wrong, I get it twice. And actually, one of the things I love about performing this project is it requires a lot of discipline on my part. It requires me to be really even more careful than I would be normally about every note I play.
Yeah. Well, when musicians started working with tape loop technology as far back as the 60s and 70s, if you made a mistake, it went into the loop and it just kept going. And then you had to figure out a way to make that work or wait for it to fade away. So I guess it's not, it's new techniques, but a lot of the ideas in this are, as you say, they go back to classical composers of 300 years ago.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, even further, certainly the idea of canon, for example,
Yes.
is something I use a lot in this project. That's got to be one of the oldest things known to man. I'm sure if cavemen were singing, I'm sure they're doing canons. One person sings something and other person repeats it.
Row, row, row your boat, for example.
Yeah.
One of the oldest surviving pieces of music in the English language, it's in Old English, is around a canon. Sumer is a kumenin.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I got to check that out.
Yeah, absolutely. So where did you learn to do all the tech part of this? As someone who's been a pianist and an improviser for most of your life, do you have that part? Did you study this in school?
So, one of the things that gets me most excited about this project is it's one of those moments in the life of a person. I think it probably happens to a lot of people where you suddenly realize that really disparate things that you've gotten into in your life come together,
right,
and contribute all together to one thing. And that's what happened in this project for me, because I've been playing the piano since I was 6. My grandfather was a jazz pianist. My mom was an opera singer, and music is a huge part of my life. But my dad is a biologist, and his father was a biologist, and science has also been a really central part of my life since I was a kid. And I actually did an undergrad in astrophysics. I have a bachelor's in astrophysics. But what's funny
you and
is
Brian May of Queen.
Oh yeah, that's right. I remember that. Yeah. Not all that uncommon amongst musicians, especially like jazz musicians. Herbie Hancock has a degree in electrical engineering. But yeah, so I've always loved science my whole life. Really been interested. As soon as I got into music, started being interested about the math behind it.
Mm-hmm.
But the computer programming is almost like a third thing, because I didn't learn any computer programming when I was doing physics. I was just doing math and physics and experiments and all that. The computer programming happened because my dad brought back a Mac Plus in like the late 80s. He brought it back to our place, and I was probably 8 or 9, and just started writing super rudimentary programs. And as a result, I feel privileged that happened at that time in my life, because I have this relationship to programming that feels really natural, because I've been doing it just little by little, teaching myself. I've been doing it my whole life. I've been doing it since I was a kid. So it's always been the case, pretty much as long as I can remember, that if there's some idea I have that a computer can do, I can figure out how to do it at the computer. And obviously in the last 5 years, as I've been working on this project, I've gotten even deeper into that.
So another meaning to the term natural machines. This is something that comes naturally. It feels organic to you as a person. The next piece you're going to play for us, what comes first? I guess you have to decide what the general rule will be, or do you have an outcome in mind? How do you start a piece like this?
You mean like when I sat down the first time and wrote down some rules?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely all about messing around. I think of Alexander Fleming and the discovery of penicillin. That was a complete accident. And I talked to my dad about this a lot. Again, he's a scientist, about how many of the best discoveries in science really kind of arose by accident. That's really the way it's been with this stuff. I mean, sometimes I'll have an idea, like, as you mentioned earlier, I've been playing the Goldberg variations now for a long time, and those have really specific algorithms in them, specific systems of rules that Bach uses. So sometimes I'll be like, okay, let me see if I can program that system of rules and see what that gives me. But more often than not, the result is really unpredictable to me, because you set up a system of rules, but then the question is, what does it bring out of you? The rule is completely uninteresting, really. I mean, who cares about a rule? What's interesting about, the rules of tennis or soccer is what it makes humans do.
Right.
That's what's fascinating about constraints. And I can't predict, as an improviser, what's going to come out of me. I have friends come over to my place and try these algorithms, and they play completely different stuff from what I'm playing.
Yeah.
So that's really what this has been all about. It's having an idea, programming it, and then just sitting down, playing with it sometimes for hours and just seeing where that takes me.
So what's the idea behind, is it Inversions that we're going to hear next?
I think I'm going to do...
Dan Tepfer, calling tunes.
That's right. That's exactly the way this is. Yeah, I think I'll do inversion. Yeah,
All right.
yeah, because that'll really illustrate what we're talking about here, which is simple rules. You know, inversion is an algorithm where I do something that Bach does, for example, in variations 12 and 15 of the Goldberg variations, where he has a canon, but it's an inverted canon.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is that there's an axis of symmetry pretty much in the middle of the piano. And whatever gets played on one side gets reflected exactly onto the other side. And, you know, that's such a simple thing.
So if you play the third key above middle C, the third key below will sound as well. Is that
exactly.
that kind of mirror reflection?
So like right now I'm mirroring around F sharp. So if I play an F sharp, it's going to play an F sharp.
Okay.
If I play a G, it's going to play an F, and etc. And that's, you know, such a basic thing.
Yeah, yeah.
But actually, when you're dealing with that, you have to start thinking about what kind of music is palindromic. Because if you want things to reflect onto themselves and create consonants, then you got to be dealing with palindromic modes. And palindromic modes, this means a scale that is intervallically the same going up or down.
Oh, like a whole tone scale? Or?
That's a good example of one. So for example, if I do whole tone going up from F sharp, see how that's reflected onto itself?
Right.
I went up in whole tone and it went down in whole tone too, right?
And again, you're doing only the up part. The
That's
piano,
right.
the disclavier is providing the down part.
Absolutely. I was just playing with my left hand just now. But there are a lot of other scales that are palindromic.
Okay.
So you set up that simple rule, and I didn't even predict that it would lead me to think about what kind of all this other stuff about what are palindromic scales and which ones are the ones that inspire me as an improviser.
Well, you know, this reminds me a lot of medieval music. There are lots of medieval musical palindromes.
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely. I'm a big Ockeghem fan.
Johannes Ockeghem, yeah.
And he was all over all that stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so Inversions is the name of the piece?
Inversion, yeah.
All right, let's hear another live performance at the disclavier here in the green space. My guest is Dan Tepfer. Dan Tepfer and a piece called Inversions. As much fun to watch as to listen to see the this kind of intersecting pattern of lines, Dan, that moves across the screen. The white and the blue are inversions of each other, just as the different sides of the keyboard are. So all of this kind of interesting combination of man and machine, has this changed the way you play a quote-unquote regular piano?
You know, I think my favorite aspect of this project is that it genuinely has brought music out of me that I wouldn't have arrived at otherwise. And, you know, again, that's what's beautiful about constraints. We impose these constraints on ourselves and we surprise ourselves. And as a result, you know, when I do something like this, and I hear those sounds, when I...
You just played 3 notes and all of that music.
Yeah, you know? When I hear those sounds, when I've been at a piano and heard those sounds come out of the piano under my command, when I'm at a piano that, you know, without any of this technology, when I'm just at a normal piano, there's a part of me that just expects those sounds to come out, and then I find ways to create them.
Yeah.
So it's almost like immersion language learning or something, you know, because I'm here and I hear those sounds. They become part of me, and then, yes, they become part somehow of my vocabulary, even when I'm not using this technology.
Well, Dan, it's an amazing project. Natural Machines is the name of Dan Tepfer's recent album. of music played on this instrument, the Yamaha Disclavier. I am really glad you were able to come in with the computer, with the Disclavier, with the visuals, and perform for us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John. Thanks for all the insightful questions, too. I really appreciate that.
It's been a lot of fun. And this has been a special edition of the Soundcheck podcast. From newsounds.org, my thanks to the crew at the Green Space for allowing us to use this venue for this edition of the Soundcheck podcast.